So, as usual, I always like to start by giving a shout out to the Bite Medicine platform. So I'm sure you guys are watching this through the platform at the moment, and you'll be familiar with the fact that it includes a question and answer bank and also an online textbook as well. And Bite Medicine are very fortunately having a 40% off discount code at the moment, I believe, for the Back to Med School season. So definitely make sure to check out their platform and take advantage of that code as well to get access to their great resources. So as usual, I always like to give a bit of an introduction in case we've got any newbies to the series. So hi, my name is Shivani. I am a graduate of the University of Birmingham Medical School, and I applied to the SFP last year in 2 deaneries, so the West Midlands and London, and I took up a post in the West Midlands in medical education. I'm looking towards a medical career, and I'm looking to have mixed roles in both clinical work, research and teaching as well. And I put my contact details there at the bottom. I'm always very happy to be contacted about any questions at all. So please do feel free to get in touch. So this is just an overview of the aims and objectives for today's session. So just looking to the left, as you can see, we've kind of reached the halfway point of the series, which is really great. So well done to everyone for making it so far. And in today's session, we're going to be talking all about the academic station, which is a core station to a lot of interviews, and it's one that is very easy to get right if you know what you're talking about. So what we're going to be covering in today's session is essentially how to kind of approach appraising literature that's available at the moment. And typically that will be given to you in the format of an abstract or in a paper. And we're going to be talking about a key terminology to enable you to do this. And at the end, I'm going to be giving you my top tips for just preparing for this sort of station. So as usual, you guys know that I like to start with a bit of an icebreaker. So what we're going to do is, first of all, I'd like to find out what year group you guys are currently in. And to be able to do this, we're going to switch over to menti.com. So if you go to Menti and type in the code at the top of the screen right now, just let me know what year group you guys are in so I know who I'm pitching this session to. Okay, are we feeling a little shy today? No one wants to volunteer. Don't be afraid to just pop your answer in. It's completely anonymous, so it would just help me to know what sort of level I'm pitching this session in. Okay, so we've got some 4th years so far. Lovely. So you're thinking nice and in advance right there. That's really lovely to see. Okay, so let's now move on to my next icebreaker question, which is essentially, how do you feel about the academic station and how to approach it in an SFP interview? So again, if you go back to menti.com, again, just feel free to vote for any of these. It's completely anonymous, so don't be afraid to pop an answer in. Okay, so we're not feeling too confident about this station. That's okay. So we're going to go through a lot of the basics today, and we're going to talk about key terminology. So hopefully by the end of the session, you'll feel a lot more confident. Okay. And the final icebreaker question is something that I think trips a lot of people up, and it's kind of interpreting key medical statistics in papers and in abstracts. So again, if we just go back to menti.com, how do you feel about interpreting key medical statistics? Okay, so we're sort of in between. So it's something that's familiar, but perhaps we could be a bit more confident. So again, I'll be talking about some of the statistics I think are key to know about for your AFP interviews tonight as well. So thank you so much for participating in that. Let's crack on and talk about the academic station in a bit more detail. So firstly, let's think about what the academic station actually is and why they include it in an SFP interview. So Essentially, because you're applying for an academic role, you undertake the academic station as a way of testing what you know about academic medicine. And it essentially involves testing whether or not you are able to critique current literature. And the term we give for that is critical appraisal. And it also sometimes consists of your understanding of academic training pathways. And the format of this station varies, but essentially the crux of it revolves around, do you understand how to appraise literature, and how committed are you to a training pathway in academic medicine? So if we think about the types of things that the academic station can involve, as I say, a lot of the academic stations will involve critical appraisal. So that could be you're given information on the day that you have to look at. It could be that you're sent information in advance, or you could also be asked to talk about a paper that you've recently read. It could also be a situation discussion type station. So you could be asked to talk about advancements in medicine or advancements in the field you're interested in or are applying to in the AFP. And you might also be given scenarios in an academic setting like we talked about for the clinical station last week. So because critical appraisal is such a key aspect of the academic station, I'm going to spend the next part of this talk just talking about my approach to appraising a piece of literature. So first of all, let's think about what critical appraisal actually is and what our gold standard of literature is. So critical appraisal is essentially your way of assessing literature and its ability to answer the question that's posed in the study. So the way to kind of think about critical appraisal is to think about what enables a study to effectively answer the question you're asking. So if we think about those characteristics, the first thing you need is a question that is clearly defined, okay? So you have to have a good idea of what it is that you're testing. The second thing is you need to have an appropriate study design that's suitable to answer your question. And you also need to have an appropriate cohort of patients. So you need to have patients who are recruited appropriately in an ethical way. And you also need to make sure that your patient population in your study represents the wider population of patients with that condition. You then need to think about, is your intervention appropriate or is your comparator appropriate for answering your question? And for that, you need to think about, are those two aspects clearly defined and relevant? And finally, you need to think about your outcomes and whether they're both clearly defined, but also are they appropriate to answer your question? So essentially, the process of critical appraisal is effectively checking whether the literature you have at hand meets these sorts of criteria. So if we think about our approach to critical appraisal, I break it down into simple steps. So the first step is to think about what the features of the study are. So this is where you're effectively thinking about what the research question is, who wrote the paper, and what journal was it published in. The second thing to think about is the internal validity. And we'll talk about what this means in a bit. But essentially what this consists of is looking at what the study design was, what the PICO criteria were, and what were the results of the study and were they effective statistics to use. You then want to think about external validity, and this essentially assesses the study's generalizability to the wider patient population, and also whether the study can be applied to your own practice. As always, you want to think about any ethical factors in the scenario, and you want to finish off with a nice summary of your appraisal and how you would make use of this article. So there are a couple of new terms there, the first of which is internal validity. So essentially what this means is, to what extent can the study in front of me yield a result that is close to the true value that I'm looking for? And external validity is the degree to which the results that you have at hand from the study cohort can be applied to the wider patient cohort from which those original study participants were sampled. So essentially, there are two measures of looking at whether the study is able to yield a true result. So the way we're going to work through and apply this method is to take a look at an example abstract and work through it together. So this is an example abstract that I've pulled, so I'm just going to pause here to give you a moment to read this. And this abstract is very typical of the type of abstract that you would be given on the day or in advance for an interview. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to skim read that abstract and get a gist of what's going on. So let's now use our approach to critical appraisal to break this down and see what we think about this abstract. So, as I say, step one is to think about the study's features. So in this, we're looking first of all at what the research question is. And if we use our example abstract, the research question can be put as, does dexamethasone improve 28-day mortality compared to usual care for hospitalized COVID-19 patients? So you can see that this abstract is good because it has a nice and specific research question. The next thing to think about is who wrote this paper. So are they from a particular area? Do they have any vested interests? And unfortunately, in this scenario, we've not got the authors available, so we can't really comment. And finally, you want to think about what journal was this published in? And this article was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a high impact factor journal. So let's just pause there to learn what impact factor means. So you'll see this commonly thrown around in the research setting. And essentially, impact factor is a measure of the implications of a journal's publications. And what it essentially corresponds to is the number of citations that journal receives from their articles, and also the number of articles that they publish over a particular time period. And that's essentially used as an indicator of the quality of the journal. So our journals like the New England Journal of Medicine and the Lancet have high impact factors and are deemed to be high quality journals. So that's why this is of relevance in this section. So the next step is to think about internal validity. So in this, we first of all want to think about what the study design was. And as I say, in this example, we've got a randomized control trial, and randomized control trials are very classically used in AFP interviews. So it's important to be comfortable with them. The next thing to think about in terms of the study design is where it ranks in terms of the hierarchy of evidence. So then you want to think about not only its rank in that hierarchy, but also does it answer the research question that we're asking? So in our situation, the RCT ranks quite high in the hierarchy of evidence, and we'll look into that a bit more in a second. And in terms of answering our study question, we can say, yes, it does, okay? Because we've got an intervention and a comparator and we're testing them together. So let's pause to think about what the hierarchy of evidence actually is at this point in time. So essentially what this hierarchy is, it's a common pyramid that you'll see used in evidence-based medicine, and it's used to stratify the type of study designs by their ability to give you valid results, and also whether or not they're susceptible to biases. And essentially what this corresponds to is what is the quality of the study design and how strong and reliable is the evidence we gain from that study. So this is the pyramid you will commonly see. So the bottom is kind of the lowest tier and the top is the highest tier of evidence. So if we go through each of the stages of the pyramid, at the very bottom, you have what's called experts' opinion articles. And this is essentially where senior consultants or experts in their fields will be invited by journals to give an opinion about a subject area. So it's essentially entirely subjective according to what the person chooses to write about. The next level is a case series or case report. And essentially what this is you have interesting cases that people see in clinical practice, or a series of linked cases that were similar, and they're written up by a group of individuals and published just to kind of generate scientific interest in novel areas. The next step up is a case control study. So essentially in this type of study, you retrospectively identify the relationship between a disease and a risk factor. So it's all about identifying risk factors for disease. And one step on from that is a cohort study. And there are two types of cohort study. One is a prospective study in which you have participants with an exposure who are followed up forward in time. But you also have a retrospective study as well, which is where participants with a particular disease will have their records searched for particular predefined exposures. Then going up from that, you have randomized controlled trials, which are when participants are allocated to receive either an intervention or comparator at random. And usually this is used to study the effectiveness or efficacy of an intervention. And finally, at the very top, you have what's called a systematic review. So this is when literature searches are conducted in a robust way to synthesize evidence on a particular topic, and often the data will be meta-analyzed, so they will quantitatively be grouped together to create summary estimates of effect. So while we kind of use that hierarchy of evidence as a way of stratifying our types of evidence, remember the key is to think about whether or not the study design is appropriate for the study question. And that's because if you look at this table here, you can see that every study design, including the systematic review, always has its advantages and disadvantages. So I'll allow you to read this in your own time, but the essence of this is that you've got to be aware of what the advantages and disadvantages are for each of these types of study designs and think about whether it's appropriate for the study question. So once we've kind of thought about the study design, we can move on to think about the PICO criteria. So if we go through what PICO stands for, first of all, the first one is population. So this is essentially who's in the study and how were they recruited to the trial. Then you have the intervention. So essentially what treatment are we trying to test in the patients, and also how were participants in the study allocated to receive this intervention. You then want to think about the comparator. So you want to consider, is this a fair comparison to my intervention? And also, is this comparison clearly defined in the study? And finally, you want to think about the outcomes of the study. So you want to consider what the outcome is, and is it appropriate for answering the study question? And in the context of that, you want to analyze the results. And we'll talk about key statistics in a moment. So if we go back to our example abstract, so in the randomized controlled trial, they had 2,000 adults essentially with COVID-19 who were in hospital, but it's not clear from the abstract how we were recruited, which is a potential source of concern. Then you have the intervention. So quite clearly, they've labeled it as either IV or oral dexamethasone, but we're not quite sure on how they were allocated, which is an important limitation. If we think about the comparator in that abstract, all they mention is that it's usual care. And that means that there's potential for ambiguity because we don't know how usual care was defined. And also the authors specifically say that the trial was open label, which means the participants were aware of which trial arm they were allocated to. So that means there were potential for participants to essentially up their sticks and say that they didn't want to receive the side that they've been allocated and cross over to the other intervention side. And finally, in terms of the outcome, they've defined it as 28-day mortality, and we can consider that as appropriate for the study question. So when you're working through each of the PICO criteria, you could see that we were already picking up some potential areas for concern. So this is a really good way of kind of starting to think about biases in study and areas for concern. And we'll talk about the types of bias later, but this particular approach is good for picking those up as you go along. So once we've kind of analysed our internal validity, we've talked about our results, we can move on to think about external validity. And this is essentially thinking about, can we apply the results from this study to our wider patient population? So to be able to do that, we need to first of all think about where was the study conducted. So this is what region of the world it was conducted in, and also what care setting it was conducted in. So say, for example, if we think about our abstract, they haven't specifically mentioned where the study was undertaken, but we know that it's a very large clinical trial. And so from that, we can safely assume that they are likely to have recruited from a large number of places. So then you want to think about, are the results of the study generalizable? And we're not able to really comment on that without looking at the setting in more detail. So if we pause to think about what generalizability actually means, as I say, it essentially means whether we can confidently apply the results from the cohort of the study to the wider patient population. So if we kind of think about that in more detail, let's say I have a cohort of patients who have a particular disease, and then I decide I'm going to conduct a study, so I recruit the patients in the red circles into my study, and this makes my sample population. What generalizability essentially means is that the results of my population that I've recruited are reflective of the wider cohort. And for that to be true, essentially what it's saying is, are my participants in my study similar enough in their characteristics that they represent the wider patient cohort? So, as I say, the study's results are generalizable if the participants represent the wider patient cohort, because it means they're likely to have similar results to the wider patient cohort if we were to repeat the study again, for example. So once we've thought about our external validity, we can think about any ethical considerations. And we'll go through this in more detail next week. But just as a bit of an introduction, the first thing you need to think about is, does the study comply with the 4 pillars of medical ethics? And these are beneficence, non-maleficence, justice, and autonomy. So you need to think about the relevance of each of these pillars in the context of the article. And we'll talk about that more next time. Then you want to think about if there are any funding or conflict of interest issues. So this is important because sometimes authors might have vested interest because of the companies that they represent. And so you need to ensure that that's not an influencing factor in their research. So say, for example, in our abstract, we could say that they were funded by the Medical Research Council and the National Institute of Health Research, but we can say that it's quite positive that they've disclosed that. So they've been honest about the fact that they've received funding. And we can't see any obvious conflicts of interest, but obviously we've only been given the abstract to look at, so we would need to go back and check the statement. So that essentially is critical appraisal in a nutshell. I hope that approach made sense, and I hope using the article as an example has illustrated that. So let's now think about my top tips for critical appraisal. So in terms of things to do when you're doing your critical appraisal, the first thing is to make sure that you've read the abstract fully to get the whole picture before you start appraising. And that's because sometimes if you have questions that would answer part of your appraisal, they might be further down in the abstract. So you just save yourself time searching for information if you've just taken it all in the first place. When you're in your interview, you are often given a bit of paper or something you can have with you that you then throw away at the end. So make sure that you use that bit of paper to write down any kind of key structures. So say, for example, you could write down our critical appraisal approach and key statistics so that you have it there in front of you. You're not relying on your memory to remember all the key steps. As I say, it's very important to think about biases as we go through. So highlight these as you work through your answer. And importantly, the idea of doing this critical appraisal is to think about, does this apply to or reflect in my clinical practice? So spend time in your answer and in your preparation period thinking about, how does the article I've read or how does the abstract I've read relate to my own personal clinical practice? And particularly if you're given time to read the article or to read the abstract in advance, try to read around a bit about the subject area so that you have some context for the article and its implications to the wider medical field. In terms of things to avoid, it's important to avoid listing everything because ultimately you're giving a structured answer in a time-limited period, so you need to make sure that you're only highlighting the salient points. However, having said that, you need to also make sure that you're not skipping steps in the appraisal. So work through it systematically. If there's nothing particularly of relevance for a section, just say that you've considered it and you don't think there's anything irrelevant so that you can still be awarded marks for it, but you've not missed a step. And the final thing to avoid is to state that based on just one article alone that you've been given, you would change your practice, because naturally, research varies and it's important to collect information from a wide variety of sources to make an informed decision. So that brings us to the end of the critical appraisal section. So I'm just going to pause here. In case anyone has any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A. They're completely anonymous. Okay, so I think that means everyone is happy because I haven't received any questions through. Don't worry if you're still typing or you think you missed your opportunity. I'll be answering more questions later on as well in case anyone wants to. So let's now think about biases and statistics. So they're kind of the missing ingredient to our critical appraisal that we've not really touched on yet. So the first thing to think about are biases. And essentially, if we first think about what a bias actually is anything that leads to a systematic difference between the result that we were expecting, the true result, and the results that we've actually measured, okay? And the key is the fact that it's a systematic difference. So it's something that's consistently affected throughout the study, which suggests it's an error in the study or a mistake in the study. So the easiest way to think about biases is to split it up in the three key stages of research. The first is to think about the designing stage of research. So this is the planning stage. And essentially there are two forms of major bias that can occur in this bit. The first is a systematic difference in the participants that are recruited to the study. So essentially how participants were selected, which is why it's called selection bias. And the second is information bias. So it's a systematic difference in how information was obtained. Then you want to think about biases that can occur when the study is actually being run. So you can still have selection bias, but other important biases to think about are things like allocation bias. So that's when the way participants are assigned to each group differs systematically. You could also think about performance bias, which is when the care delivered to each of the two groups is uneven. So say, for example, one group receives more attention than the others. And importantly for RCTs, you also need to think about attrition bias. So in every trial, there will be dropouts for various reasons, but attrition bias is essentially when there is a systematic difference between the people that drop out compared to the people that remain in the study. And that suggests something is wrong in how we're supporting participants to remain in the study. So that's a very important one to be aware of. And the final thing is to think about what happens after the study happens. So this is essentially biases in publication and things that you can look back on after the study has been completed. So the important one here to think about is confounding, which is essentially when there are things that weren't measured in the study that we know about that could potentially have affected the outcome. So say, for example, an example would be you're measuring lung disease in patients and you look at smoking, but then you forget to think about I don't know, say, for example, a family history of lung malignancy, and then you're measuring something like lung cancer prevalence. So obviously, having a family history is a strong thing to think about in any kind of malignancy history. And so that would be an example of confounding in terms of outcomes. So now that we've talked about biases, let's move on to think about statistics a bit more. So this is a kind of list of the key statistics that I think you need to know about for an AFP interview. Obviously, this isn't completely exhaustive, but we're going to go through these principles now. So the first thing to think about is absolute and relative risk. So these are essentially measures of probability of an event happening. So with absolute risk, it's exactly what it says on the tin. So in its purest, simplest form, you're thinking about what is the likelihood that an event will happen? So say, for example, if we have a patient that's taking medication A, we could say the absolute risk is what is the likelihood that our patient on medication A will develop cardiovascular disease. And the way we calculate that is essentially simple probability. So it's the number of events, so say, for example, cardiovascular disease, divided by the total number of patients in our study. Relative risk is a comparative of absolute risks. So it's essentially what is the likelihood of an event happening in group A compared to group B. So if we take our example, we've got patient A on medication A, and we've got patient group B on the control. So we could say the relative risk is what is the likelihood of patients developing cardiovascular disease with medication A compared to patients who are using the control B. And the way you calculate it is essentially by dividing the absolute risks of the two groups that you're comparing. So you will also get a special type of relative risk, which is called hazard ratios. And essentially, hazard ratios are like relative risk, but they apply specifically to mortality data. And there's a specific way of calculating it, which is called the Kaplan-Meier method. So often in randomized controlled trials and things, you'll see these Kaplan-Meier curves, and I've got a picture of one below that somebody's very nicely made. So these are essentially ways of measuring mortality data in terms of risk. The next key principle not to confuse with relative risk and absolute risk is odds and odds ratios, okay? So they're another way of expressing probability, but whereas absolute risk was looking at the pure probability, odds is essentially looking at the ratio of an event happening compared to the event not happening. So it's a slightly different way of expressing probability. So, as I say, odds is essentially a comparative of an event happening compared to it not happening. So say, for example, in our example patient, we could say, what are the odds of a patient on medication A developing cardiovascular disease compared to them not developing cardiovascular disease? Then you want to think about, that should say odds ratio. So essentially, it's a comparative, very similar to relative risk. So you could say, for example, what are the odds of a patient in using medication A developing cardiovascular disease compared to patients using control B? And like with relative risk, you calculate it by dividing the odds in one group by the odds in the other. So that's essentially measures of probability. The next thing you want to think about is sensitivity and specificity. So these are kind of things that are more relevant in terms of diagnostic accuracy. So they're looking at diagnostic or screening tests, and they're trying to work out how accurate are they for picking up on diseases of interest. So sensitivity is the proportion of patients that have a disease who, when they have this test that we're looking into, they yield a positive test result, okay? So it's the ability of the test to pick up a positive result among the patient that has the disease. Whereas specificity is an exclusionary measure. So it's the proportion of patients who don't have the disease that return a negative test result. And often you'll see this sort of chart that's used to calculate sensitivity and specificity. So on the top, we'll have patients who have the disease and who don't, and then you have the test results as well. So it's all about working out what are the rates of patients who are truly positive in our test, and also what are the patients who are truly negative with our test. So the way you work out sensitivity and specificity are as below. So as I say, sensitivity is when you're trying to look at the proportion of patients who are truly positive, so this top green one, and specificity is when you're looking at the patients who are truly negative, that should say, sorry. So it should be truly negative. So then you want to think about precision and accuracy. So these are terms that are also thrown around a lot. And there are kind of three key terms to know about in terms of precision and accuracy. So the first thing this kind of all corresponds to is error. And error is essentially what the difference is between the value that we've measured in our study compared to the true value of that sample. And so accuracy is a measure of how similar our obtained result is to that true value. Whereas precision is a measure of how close the values we've measured are to one another, okay? And the way we often quantify precision in research is using what's called confidence intervals. So confidence intervals are essentially, if you were to have a study and you repeated the study over and over and over again an infinite number of times, essentially 90% or whatever percentage of the time that's quoted is the values between which the true value would lie. So it's not a range for the true value, it's just an estimate of the range within which we know the true value exists. So the narrower the confidence interval, the more precise our study results. And a good way to kind of think about this is with this sort of kind of bullseye chart. So you can see that the ones where the the darts are kind of close together is the ones that are precise, whereas the ones that are closest to the bullseye, which represents our true value, are the ones that are accurate. So they are two different things. And I think looking at this sort of pictorial representation is quite helpful. So that brings us to the end of our statistics. I'm going to pause here because I can see a question. So we've got a question thinking back to the first section we talked about, which is essentially saying, do you only appraise the abstract in the interview or the full text too? So the answer to this is that it depends on the deanery you're interviewing in. Some deaneries will only give you an abstract. Some deaneries will send you the whole paper or ask you to read the whole paper in advance. I've not actually heard of a deanery giving you a whole paper to read on the day. That I think that would be quite harsh, but never say never. Hopefully that helps. So, are there any more questions that anyone wants to ask at this point? I appreciate statistics is something that confuses a lot of people, so do feel free to ask questions. As I say, they're completely anonymous. Okay. So I think we're happy for now. So let's plow on with our last section, which is all about how to prepare for this sort of station. So this station is probably the station that will be newest to a lot of people. So it's important to kind of allow yourself time to prepare for this sort of station. So obviously, if we're thinking back to September when you first finished your white space questions, as always, I always recommend that you have a bit of a break to give yourself a breather. And then in terms of kind of actually preparing, the first step is to kind of focus on learning all of the terminology and how to kind of appraise papers. So I'm going to go through some resources that I found helpful, but essentially in this stage, you need to kind of focus on learning definitions of all those statistics and biases we talked about, and you need to be able to confidently appraise articles. So the way I used to do this is I used to go on PubMed and I would search major journals and recent publications in those major journals, and I would practice with my appraisal format every single day to kind of get good at looking at studies and appraising literature within a time limit. And particularly if you're going for an interview where you are asked to bring your own study in to discuss, it's important to read around and be up to date with the literature in your field of interest, because naturally you need to contextualize the research you're reading. So having an awareness of what's going on in the research field is really important. So once you feel confident with kind of the terminology and practicing by yourselves, you then need to think about practicing with other people. So like with the clinical one, try and find other applicants and make up your own cases using articles on PubMed and practicing with one another under a time limit. And the way I used to do this was I used to combine this with doing the clinical practice as well, like it was like a mini mock interview. So that way you could kind of get experience of what to expect in that scenario. And then obviously, once you kind of get confident doing that, you can move on to doing mock interviews. And like I'll mention in a second, these are both available through your university and online as well. And in the immediate time before the interview, do make sure to have a bit of a break as well. So in terms of resources for preparation, I firstly really want to recommend YouTube as a great resource for this. So I'll put pictures of a couple of videos and things that I found really useful. So one is the Ali Abdaal critical appraisal video, and the other is the Crush course video. And they're very good as a way of kind of familiarizing yourself with all the terminology we talked about. Obviously, you can reach out to people like myself, so SFP doctors, through things like Twitter or email, and make sure you're using and working with your other applicants as well, because they are probably your best learning resource for preparing. There are lots of kind of free mock interviews available that include academic stations. So this is just a list from what I remembered from what I did last year. And in terms of actually learning appraisal, there's something called the CASP tools. So they're essentially an extended version of how to appraise literature. They kind of publish sort of paper frameworks that you can use in the early stages to kind of get confident with appraising literature. So I'd recommend checking those out, and obviously make use of articles that are being published in major journals on PubMed, because those are the ones that they're likely to bring up in your interviews. So hopefully that's all made sense. And to test kind of what you've learned so far, I've got a little anonymous quiz for you of a few questions. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to menti.com and we'll work through a few questions together. So the first question is, which of these study designs ranks highest in the hierarchy of evidence, so that pyramid that I showed you earlier? So if we go back to menti.com, you just need to kind of go to menti.com, type in the code, and we'll wait for some people to play the quiz. Okay, so we've got a couple of people joining. So if we press enter, let's look at the first question. So which of these study designs ranks the highest? Okay, yeah, well done. So everyone's got this one right. So randomized controlled trials are the ones that rank highest. And if you weren't sure why it's correct, you can always go back and look at that pyramid of evidence. So the next question is, the ability for a study to yield results close to the true value is best described by which of these terms? So we've got internal validity, external validity, generalizability, and precision. So if we go back to Menti, okay, so the answer here is internal validity, okay? So remember, precision is the proximity of the values that we've obtained to one another, not necessarily to the true value. So it's possible for results to be precise because they're all within a close interval to one another, but they may not actually be anywhere near close to what our true value is. Whereas internal validity is the term we use to describe the proximity of the results, the kind of idea that a study is able to obtain results that are closer to the true value, so close to the bullseye on our little diagram. Hopefully that makes sense. So if we go back to the PowerPoint, the next question is, what is the name given to bias arising from systematic differences in dropouts from a study? So we've got 4 options: selection bias, information bias, attrition bias, and allocation bias. So if we go back to the Menti, okay, yes, well done. So this one is attrition bias. So remember, selection bias is how participants were recruited to the study. Information bias is how information was obtained. And allocation bias is how participants were allocated to groups within the study. So well done for that one, guys. And we've got one more question for you. So this one's a bit tricky, so take your time to read it. It says, in a study, investigating the use of remdesivir, so a drug, compared to usual care for COVID-19 survival, which of the following answers is the best interpretation for the following statistic? And so the statistic is odds ratio for survival was 1.22, okay? So we've got 4 options for how we can interpret this odds ratio. We've got option A, which is the likelihood of survival is 22% higher compared to usual care. Option B is the likelihood of survival is 22% in patients using remdesivir. Option C is the odds of survival are 1.22, whereas D is the odds of survival are 1.22 times greater among patients using remdesivir compared to usual care. Okay, so these are A, B, C, and D. If we go back to the Menti, which one do you think is correct? Okay, so we were a bit split here. So let's go back to the answer options and have a look as to why D was the correct one. So remember, the first thing to think about is odds. Okay, we're looking at an odds ratio. And when we interpret odds, we don't describe it in terms of likelihood. Okay, so we always describe odds in terms of odds because they're slightly different than we say to kind of relative risk. So options A and B are more in line with interpretations of risk and relative risk. So then we're kind of left with C and D. So the reason why the answer is D and not C is because, remember, odds ratios are comparative, okay? So we need to make sure that our answer includes a comparative element, which is why D is the correct answer. If we just had odds, the correct answer would be C. Hopefully that makes sense. So this is a list of references that I used to make this presentation, and that brings us nicely to the end of the session. So thank you so much for watching. I would really appreciate if you filled out this feedback form by scanning in the QR code. I genuinely read every single response that I get given, and it would be really helpful for me to learn what you guys found useful and what you guys would like to do differently next time. I'm also very happy to take questions at this point, so please feel free to ask anything about what we've covered in today's session or anything about AFP interviews or SOP interviews at all.